As we saw in a previous Hotwire exploration, you can mark elements on the page as being persistent. And what that means is that TurboDrive will keep a cached version of that element in its cache, and then as you navigate to new pages, if there are elements with the same ID, instead of rendering the new element, it's going to render the cached version of the element. And I thought this might be a fun use case for toast messages. Now, to explore toast messages, you can add and remove notes from this Cold Fusion application, and you'll see little messages pop in from the bottom here. So let's add foo, and you can see we have our little note has been added, slides in. We can delete this message. You can see note has been deleted, and you'll see that these are persisting across our page navigations. We can add another note and another note. And now we can also click to remove some of these notes. And again, you'll see that as I'm going through these navigations, I can use the back button, I can use the forward button, and these are being persisted. And if we look at this element, what we'll see here is that we have data turbo permanent set to, well, it's a Boolean attribute. So its existence merits this to be persisted across navigations. Now, the challenge with that is that how do we add new messages to our persisted element? Because if we try to render a new message inside of our CFML response, it's going to be ignored because this element is permanent. So in order to do that, I'm going to use a stimulus controller to essentially translate new data into persisted data. And let's take a look at how that works. Well, first, let's take a look at the URL. So in order to create the messages, what you'll see is that in the URL, I'm passing back a URL parameter indicating what type of thing just happened. So here, flash add success. And if we do delete, we can see flash delete success. This demo isn't about the mechanics of flash messages or toast messages. This is just, I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. I have no sessions running. I have no database running. I have no cookies being set. So I'm just literally telling the main page that something happened, and it's going to translate that into toast messages. But again, that's not the point of this exploration. So if we look at our main page, what we can see is here those URL flags. And if those flags are turned on, we're going to use this request scope new toasts array, and we're just going to append some markup. This new toasts array is then going to be used in our page layout to define new toasts inside of our toaster component, and that's going to be inside of this pages template, this Cold Fusion custom tag. So if we look in our Cold Fusion custom tag, we can see our toaster element, and what you'll notice is that the toaster element here is composed of what I'm calling two different slots. It has a new target and an old target, and it's the old target that's being set as data turbo permanent. So this one toaster controller is managing a transient area of the DOM, right? This is going to be re-rendered fresh on every page, but it's also managing a permanent portion of the DOM. This is going to be pulled out of the TurboDrive page cache. And in fact, what you see when we go to add or remove something, so let's add a new note. And if we look at the DOM, what we'll see is that this new note, your note has been added, is actually inside of our new non-persistent transient portion of this controller. It's not inside of the turbo permanent. Those are the three old notes. However, if we then go to a different page and we look at the DOM, we still have all four of these messages. But upon closer inspection of our toaster controller, what we can see is that the transient portion, that toaster target new, is actually empty. And now all four of the toast messages appear inside of our data turbo permanent element. And what's happening is that our stimulus controller is on page unload or before cache is taking elements that are transient and it's moving them into the permanent portion. And the reason that this works is because the cache is populated just prior to navigation, and it's going to cache all of the runtime changes to the DOM. So in fact, if we say change this to background pink and then we cancel, what you'll see is that background color persists across pages. And that's because we made a runtime modification to a persistent element, and those runtime modifications were persisted to the page cache. Similarly, our stimulus controller is going to make runtime modifications by moving things out of our transient container and into our persistent container. So let's take a closer look at how that works. So again, when the page loads for the first time, we're going to loop over those new toasts. That's, if we go back to our index page quickly, those are the things being pushed in here. And it's going to render them as new toast elements. And then this, we're not going to render anything into because that's coming out of the cache. And now let's take a look at our controller element here. We have our toaster controller, and we're going to bind to the turbo before cache event on the document. And then we're going to call handle before cache. So let's take a look at our toaster controller. Our toaster controller, you can see here, has targets for new and old. Now, because old is a persistent element, it's not necessarily available the same time other targets are available because of how the DOM gets updated from the cache. But that doesn't matter because we're in the before cache and everything's been reconciled by then. So let's jump down to our before cache. So the user has just clicked an action. They want to move to a new page in our ColdFusion application, and we have an opportunity to adjust the DOM just before it gets pushed into the page cache. And what you can see is that we're looping over the children in the new target controller, or the new target element, and that's the one that holds the transient data. We're reversing it just so that they show up in the correct order. And then we're taking that node and we're prepending it to the old target. And when you take a DOM node that's present in the tree and you prepend it to something else, it will implicitly remove it from wherever it is. A node can only exist in one place at one time. So this prepend isn't just a prepend, it's a remove from the new target as much as it is a add to the old target. And because this creates a DOM change prior to caching, this DOM change will then be persisted with the cache itself. So in that way, we're able to use persistent elements and merge in items that get updated as the application continues to be interacted with. Now, some of this complexity has to do with those animations because I feel like that made the demo much more interesting than just having them at the bottom. If we didn't have animations, we could get rid of things like the animation end event, which is actually physically removing things from the DOM. We could just remove them directly from the DOM. But there's really not a whole lot of code here at all. One thing that is interesting to look at is that if we jump back into our main page, if we look at the actual toast item, so the message, you can see that we're binding to the click event and we're calling remove toast. If we look at remove toast, one thing that you'll see is that it adds this attribute data turbo cache set to false. Now we end up removing the node from the DOM, so this is much less of an issue, but it is very interesting to see that even inside of a persisted element, if you set data turbo cache to false, that element, that child element, will not be persisted to the page cache. So you can even mix and match cached and non-cached elements inside of a persistent element, which is pretty cool. And the cool thing about this is that it's all progressively enhanced. So if we come up here and we actually comment out our script tag, so now we're running just ColdFusion, right? Like let's look at the DOM here. There is no JavaScript file being added. This shows up because we just had this flash message in the URL when we refreshed. And now as we navigate around, you can see that we get our live message, the transient one, the one that was just created. But what we don't get is that persistence message across the navigations, right? But again, we continue to see the live ones. So that's less of an exciting user experience. But how freaking cool is this? Like, we completely progressively enhance this ColdFusion application to have I think a fairly complex user experience here. And then we can degrade it to using just ColdFusion. Anyway, I'm just excited about learning about Hotwire and ColdFusion. So hopefully there's something interesting here. And yeah, I'll have more fun explorations coming soon.